Back in 2013, Radley Balko wrote the book on the militarization of the police. It's called Rise of the Warrior Cop, and in the 12 years since it came out, its stature has only grown. So when he wrote a terrifying piece called The Police Militarization Debate is Over in his newsletter, The Watch, I naturally took note. Radley, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The piece is terrifying. I don't know any other word for it, but before we get into why, talk about what the debate over police militarization has been for the past several decades. Would I be correct in framing it as a debate between people who say the police have to have bigger and badder weaponry so they're not outgunned, and they have to be allowed to use tactics that might not always strictly adhere to the Constitution? And then on the other side, there's folks like you who have argued that turning cops into warfighters who use the same equipment and tactics as our armed forces is wrongheaded and dangerous. Is that a fair summation of the debate?
Yeah, I think that the point here is that, going back to the founding, there's always been this kind of healthy skepticism of using the military for domestic policing. The founders were very wary of standing armies for precisely that reason. And since then, we've done a pretty good job of keeping the military out of domestic policing. There have been a few times when they've been called up, but it's always been temporary. That's been, kind of treated with the solemnity and the kind of profundity of that decision. Like, we're going to do this because this threat is wrong, or, is immediate and urgent. But, we know that this is a thing that we don't do in this country, and so we're going to treat it that way. The only real exception was Reconstruction, which obviously was a pretty big deal, and it was necessary in that particular context. So we've done a pretty good job of that. What I've been arguing for most of my career is that where we've dropped the ball is we've let the police become more and more like soldiers. We've trained them like soldiers, armed them like soldiers. We tell them they're fighting a war. They've adopted kind of the mentality of soldiers. In fact, one bit of feedback I've gotten over the course of my career is people in the military telling me, I agree with your general point about police, but like, we aren't even that bad, right? Like, when police saw, or when military people saw what was coming out of Ferguson, they were appalled. They were like, we don't even treat people, in Iraq and Afghanistan that way. And so that's been a debate for a long time. It's been sort of like, what does domestic policing look like? How is it, soldiers have a very different set of skills than police. It's a different task. It's a different mission.
Right.
It's dangerous to conflate the two. So yeah, I think your summary was pretty spot on.
Okay, so why is the debate over? And why do I have the feeling that the people on our side lost?
Right. So, the debate was always, I have vehement disagreements with people on the other side of the debate, but the debate was always about which of these two roles is appropriate in a free society. And the people on the other side were like, doesn't we can dress cops like soldiers and arm looks like soldiers and put them in camouflage and it's not a threat to society. But there was still this shared understanding that it's bad for the people who do our day-to-day policing to think of us as the enemy, right? Yeah, there's still a shared understanding that there are constitutional limits for both cops and soldiers. The question is which one should apply, when people are patrolling the streets. And the argument I'm trying to make in the post is that debate is over because Trump doesn't give a shit about any of that. I mean, what he wants is his own personal paramilitary force that will do his bidding. He wants somebody he can sick on his enemies. He wants somebody who can, if people are protesting, show how strong he is by, shooting people in the kneecaps as he tried to do it during his first term. And it kind of erases this entire debate. One of the more really alarming things that Pete Hegseth did after he took over the Pentagon was he fired all the JAG officers. Now, these are the lawyers who determine the rules of engagement, who tell the military when they're doing something that is, unconstitutional or that conflicts with federal court rulings. They're the ones who tell the president when he can't do something that he wants to do. And they got rid of all those people for a very specific reason, because Trump doesn't want any limits on what he can do. And he made this very clear over the course of his career. I mentioned in the piece about all of his dumb tweets about, cops, soldiers, and bikers who are going to be his muscle and do his enforcing for him. That's what he wants. He wants his own personal army, and he's getting it. the courts and Congress are complying.
You say this in the piece, and I think it's very fair to say that for Donald Trump, there is no difference between cops and troops, is there?
No, I mean, he sees the entire federal government as, he sees the DOJ as his personal law firm. They're giving fucking polygraphs to FBI agents, not on their fidelity to the Constitution or whether they're, double agents working for a foreign government. They're giving them polygraphs to test their loyalty to Donald Trump and Kash Patel. I mean, that's who they want to screen for. They want to make sure everybody's loyal. And, we've seen this throughout Trump's hiring process during his second term over and over. There have been lots of media reports about this. But when people are questioned when they're interviewing for jobs, they're asked about whether they're loyal to Trump. That's the only thing that matters. It's not about the Constitution, it's about serving the public.
The thing is, though, I feel like most of this debate was focused on cops becoming more like the military. Like, for example, the name of your book was The Rise of the Warrior Cop. Now it seems like the flip side of that, the military being used as sort of, quote unquote, super cops, has at the very least sort of achieved parity.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think one of the things I argue in the piece is, the National Guard has been called up before to put down insurrections, riots. Even during the 80s, we saw the National Guard invoked by state governors to fight the drug war. We saw them frequently in California. They would patrol the mountains and wilderness to find, illicit pot farms. They were even used to raid, housing projects in the cities. And, that was all terrible. And I think those were all abuses of power. But in every one of those cases, it was the state governor that called up the Guard. Now, in some cases they were working with the DEA or some federal agency, but it was the state governor who was like, this is an emergency. This is bad enough that we need this extra help. Again, I argue this in the piece. I don't think that the crack epidemic justified the kind of trampling on civil liberties that we saw, but there was a crack epidemic, right? I mean, people were dying. There was a lot of violence associated with as the kind of black market shifted, as crack kind of came onto the scene. So there was a plausible reason why this kind of force might have been necessary. Again, we could have that debate. Trump is calling up the Guard, over the objections of state governors, right? Their explicit objections. That's never happened before in our history, ever. And then he's deploying active duty military also over the objections of governors. And that only has happened a couple times. And once, the last time it happened was in Little Rock, to desegregate Little Rock High School or Central High School in Little Rock. And he's doing it over an emergency that doesn't exist. It's a lie, right? He's been saying from the start that we're being invaded by migrants. And, my illegal border crossings have been down over the last 3 years, down the last 2 years of the Biden administration. And his argument is that we're getting invaded and all these people are committing crimes. Well, crime is down for the last 3 years and it's about to hit record lows. There's no evidence that undocumented people commit crimes at higher rates than native-born people. If anything, it's just the opposite. There is no urgency here. He's calling, this is a show of force and a show of power. He is calling these troops up to demonstrate that he is a strong man, on par with the strong men who he idolizes and envies. And that's, terrifying. That is not what troops are for. It's not what the National Guard is for. It's not what the Marines are for.
Yeah, there was a report the other day that I think it was the Marines who were deployed to Los Angeles only detained one person the whole time they were there, which obviously it should have been 0 people. But it really does feel like, as you said, they weren't really sent there to do anything beyond project power, and in particular, project that Donald Trump has power.
Right. Well, I mean, it's illegal for them to do domestic policing. They can serve in a support role, but if they had been arresting people, we'd be, in a whole different zip code here in terms of alarm. But that's what he wants. That's where he wants to be. I think that there is. The thing that I find really terrifying is, we've seen how Trump has been gutting the intelligence agencies and not just gutting them, but also filling them with people who aren't going to tell him what he needs to know, but what he wants to hear. That's not what the intelligence community is supposed to be doing. And it's going to make us really vulnerable to another attack. And I worry that, if people start protesting against Trump, he's going to crack down and bring the military. But I'm more worried that we're going to be vulnerable to a September 11th style attack, and Trump's going to respond by declaring martial law and deploying the military. I mean, that is, I think, the existential threat, because he doesn't want to be blamed for it if it happens. And so he's going to crack down on anybody who suggests that, and he's going to use the fear that will be, it's one thing to sort of crack down on, the No Kings protest when there's this massive resistance where people become very compliant and very acquiescent to, tyrannical power is when they're scared, and no, we're never more scared than we are after an attack. And so if there's some kind of September 11th style attack, I mean, I think that opens the door to complete authoritarianism. I think that's the scenario I fear most.
Yeah. So, I'm an Army veteran, and I've always had at least a little bit of faith that even if a president failed to understand that the military isn't a domestic police force, at least the upper echelons of those who wear the uniforms, the generals and admirals, and the civilians at the Department of Defense, that at least they understood that and were ready to, sort of project that. I'm not sure I feel that way anymore, Radley, because of what you just said, because of the people that he's kicked out and the people that he's replaced them with.
Yeah, one of the examples I give a lot of time, I think the idea of bringing up National Guard troops to, clear Lafayette Park, for example, the optics of that were terrible, and the motivation and thinking behind it were really alarming. But, one of the things I took comfort in is that while you saw the federal police departments use violence to clear that park, where you saw pushback, it was from the National Guard. The National Guard,
Right.
they were not happy to be there. You saw troops testifying before Congress, directly contradicting what the White House was claiming. And I think that's because the National Guard is made up of us, right? I mean, National Guard troops are not lifelong cops who've been immersed in police culture and toxic sort of us versus them mentality. The National Guard is made up of like the guy who works on your car and the guy who fixes your air conditioning. And, these are all, they're us, right? So I take some comfort in the idea that I don't think National Guard troops are going to, open fire on citizens like we saw at Kent State. I think they're the least likely force to do that. The problem is that Trump is assembling this ICE Border Patrol DHI force that, is going to be doubled or tripled over the next couple of years. They're not going to, the only way they find people to fill out those numbers to staff up like that is by lowering their standards and hiring people who the only qualification is going to be loyalty to Trump. And so if that turns into Trump's personal paramilitary force, those aren't the people who are going to question his orders. Those are going to be people who are going to be enthusiastic about carrying them out.
Totally agree with all of that. But just getting back to the military for a second, you write in the piece, I think that you talk about how a lot of this seems to be driven by the fact that Trump can't stand that in his first term, he was told that he couldn't order people to shoot protesters.
Yep.
And I feel like those people who told him he couldn't do that are not around anymore.
Oh, yeah.
And particularly, with Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, with the generals he now, has around him, I feel like there may not be someone who's going to tell him that, no, you in fact can't order troops you can't order troops to shoot at peaceful protesters.
Yeah, I guess at some level, I still hope that, he can't replace the entire military. So I hope at some point in the chain, and you're going to get people who still, understand those kind of basic values. Maybe that's naive of me to hope that. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it's telling that Trump replaced the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with a guy who literally, according to Trump, told him he loved him and that he would kill for him, right? I mean, that's who he put at the head of the military. And of course, you have Hegseth, who, thinks the military should be recruited in a holy war and thinks that Trump was sent by God. So yeah, I mean, I would hope that, I mean, the funny thing is, the biggest fear of the founders was that there would be a military coup, right? That the military would take over the civilian control. And so that's why we have civilian control of the military. What they didn't anticipate is that the problem would be with the civilian control and not with the military itself. I think right now we have a civilian who wants to use the military for unconstitutional reasons and pretty terrifying reasons. And the question is whether the military will defy that civilian, which is not a problem that we anticipated, as recently as 10 years ago.
Yeah. And it's a coup from the person who is already in power. Right. It's not someone trying to overthrow the person in power. It's the person in power trying to, subvert the Constitution and increase his own power. There's something you wrote about in the piece, the dual state model. Talk about that.
I guess it's sort of the phenomenon we're seeing that if you read people who, historians who have written about fascism, warn about, and there's a good piece in The Atlantic about it a couple of years ago. Also a brief written by a bunch of former DOJ attorneys during Trump's first administration. The idea of the dual state is that, you have an authority or a state or, people in charge of the government are arguing in court or making one set of arguments in court that are sort of, they're still bullshit, but they're grounded in some kind of legal principle. They're
Mhm.
plausible, I guess, in some way. Meanwhile, the policies that they're enacting that are justified by those legal arguments are completely, off the rails, right? And so we see this with Trump, where they're arguing, they're trying to parse these arguments about, rendition and, whether what kind of due process undocumented people are afforded before they send them off to, gulags and foreign slave labor camps. They aren't abiding by any of the legal arguments they're making in court, but because the courts confer this kind of legitimacy on the government because it's the government, the courts will only consider arguments in the context of the case that they're hearing. So if the Trump administration is found to have been lying to the federal courts when it comes to shutting down USAID or shutting down the Department of Education, it could be the same attorneys from the Solicitor General's office making these arguments that are openly lying to the courts and then found to openly lying to the courts and misleading them. They get another case where they're talking about, I don't know, birthright citizenship or, sending people off to foreign slave labor prisons. They still get that deference and that assumption of legitimacy, and this idea of regularity, that the government's not going to lie to the courts. Like you have to, you see this when these judges, these district court judges, they're getting lied to over and over and over again, and they're giving the administration every single chance before they try to find them in contempt. Whereas if you or I were caught doing any of those things, we'd be found in contempt on day one and thrown in a jail cell. Right. But because you're representing the government, you have this sort of assumed legitimacy and regularity. And so what it allows them to do is just allows them to continue to break the law on a regular basis, so long as they're making quasi-plausible legal arguments in court. And, for me, I've always thought it was bullshit that the courts assumed good faith on the part of the government, because, I've seen enough prosecutors and police abuse cases to know that they don't argue in good faith. And anytime the court says, oh yeah, the police broke the law here, but they had good faith, that just becomes a roadmap for police to break the law in the future. Well, like all you have to do is use these magic words and the court will assume you're acting in good faith, right? Yeah. So, it's all kind of catching up to us now. I think the Roberts court's, love of executive power, the deference to the government. And then finally you have this executive that is just openly and unapologetically operating in bad faith, lying at every turn. I mean, they lie when they don't even have to lie, and we're seeing like the kind of the foundations of our legal system kind of crumbling in front of us. And the really terrifying part is when you read, people who write about the history of fascism and the history of authoritarianism, like it's all really familiar to them, right? I mean, this is exactly, I know we're not supposed to compare anything to the Nazis, but it's exactly what the Nazis did. They made like legitimate arguments in court while they were terrorizing people on the ground, and the courts continued to just assume everything they were saying in court was legitimate. And that's where we are. I mean, I find it, I can't think about it too much because it'll drive you crazy.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's why, like I said at the top, your piece was terrifying to me, to actually think that this debate is over. And as you said, and that we are witnessing the same. I know, again, you're not supposed to compare things to the Nazis, but the playbook is just very clearly the same one. Radley, thank you so much for coming on. People, go check out The Watch. It's just an absolutely great newsletter. And if you haven't read Rise of the Warrior Cop, I don't know what's wrong with you. Radley, thanks so much.
We're doing a new edition, working on it. So look forward to next, if books are still legal.
Right. I look forward to reading it in Canada.
Yeah. Take care. Thanks.
Thanks, Radley.